So I'd like to invite Miriam and Luke to join our panel now. I'd love if you both could just spend a couple minutes just introducing yourselves and the work you do at your organization. So Miriam, could I start with you?
Thank you very much, Jason. It was really exciting to listen to that presentation, even after reading the paper. So, hi everyone. My name is Miriam Laquer. I am the research director at Give Directly. My work involves giving oversight for all the research activity that happens within Give Directly and with our partners. It's great to be here.
And I'm Luke Chahari. I am the Chief Product Officer at NFS Africa. As you heard, NFS Africa is an infrastructure provider. We basically power a lot of the payments to mobile money networks and from mobile money networks in Africa, and can currently reach about 320 million mobile phones. My work as Chief Product Officer is to lead the product strategy and try to figure out what we can build over this infrastructure that we've set up.
So a very basic question to start with, given your experience and given what you've heard from this presentation, in your words, what would you say, why might we prefer setting up deferred payment schemes? So that's for either of you, Luke or Miriam.
Happy to go first. So just quickly about what Give Directly does, in case anyone doesn't know it, before I come to answer that. So Give Directly is an international NGO. We are based right now in 11 countries. And what we do at Give Directly is to transfer cash directly to recipients. And what the cash we transfer is unconditional cash, completely no strings attached. Recipients are free to use the money any way they want and to determine for themselves which outcomes are important. So going to your question, Tanvi, why is it important to defer payments? I think I wouldn't answer that question. I think I wouldn't say it is a good idea to defer payments. I think what is really important is to find out from the recipients, would you like your transfers to be deferred? There are cases where recipients want to have their money right now because they have not built enough trust with the organization. Very interesting listening to Jason's presentation. These were permanent workers at a tea factory that had probably been around for a long time. And so there was trust. People believed that they would get their money eventually. But for many aid organizations, people look at us, we are new in the place, and they're not sure that if they deferred their money, it would eventually come. However, we should give recipients choices. If a recipient feels that they would rather defer their payments because they have a need that is down the road and it would be best to get their money at that time, then we should create our programs in a way that we can actually incentivize that choice of the recipient. So my answer is let the recipients choose.
I would say that one of the reasons for a company to consider this is it's one of those things that's counterintuitive. If anything, a lot of companies will have the ability for someone to request an advance or, maybe a loan from the company, getting money sooner rather than later. But one of the interesting benefits here is that from the company's point of view, a scheme like this is another way to capitalize. If employees are interested in deferring payments, that extra capital that the company has that it can put to other uses. So it's certainly one of those things that should be because I think a lot of models, when it first came out, was one of those things that people thought, hey,
I'm getting a little bit of
people catch with strings.
I'm hearing a little bit of delay, so hopefully we'll be able to hear from Luke in a little bit. But Jason, to Miriam's point about considering employees' choice into designing these payments, how might that actually look like when you're operationalizing these payments? How can you account for perhaps changing opinions about how workers would want their payments received?
Yeah, I think that the issue of changing opinions is a really important one, because a decent amount of the motivation for why we would think that this is important is that people are worried about self-control. So not only do they have issues with saving and with like self-control problems where maybe they overspend at certain points, but they're aware of that and they're trying to do things to mitigate those issues, right? So there is always this potential issue that if you give people maximum flexibility, then it's almost like doing nothing at all. And so I think that you want to, I think Miriam has had this really important idea that she suggested in some of our discussions about collaboration of, we want to let people sign up and then we want to give people like the option to change their mind. And we do have some evidence on the option to change their mind, but so there's a pretty small fraction of workers in our original study who, for example, said that they wanted to quit immediately or that they wanted to change their deductions. And the majority wanted to raise their deductions. But I think that if you were to go to people at all the time and constantly tell them like, hey, here's your money, do you want it right away? That's really raising the specter of temptation. And in the moment, they might want the money and want to spend it. That doesn't mean that that's like really ideal for them from their own broader perspective. And so to me, testing this out and getting different kinds of feedback from recipients about what's working the best is really the way to try to sort this out, right? So try different things and then make sure that we're not actually undermining the benefits of this approach by giving people too much flexibility. So this is Miriam's suggestion, was to basically go to some people and like let them restructure their payments, and that already gives you some information on, how much do people really want to do this.
So I think a big component of this that we haven't touched upon too much is that a lot of this can be facilitated by the transfer or by digitizing a lot of these wage payments. And so Luke, my question for you is, when we're considering incorporating these deferred payment schemes into digital payments, what are some of the sort of like design features that we need to think about as we're making this shift, and how can we best kind of like promote the use case of this?
Sounds good. Can you all hear me well?
Yes, I hear you now.
Okay. All right. So I think earlier I was saying that one of the benefits to a company for considering a scheme like this is that it's another source of funding. If you think about it, they're borrowing money from their employees, and it's one of those things that's counterintuitive, because a lot of companies have ways for employees to request money sooner, but by considering something like this, it might be beneficial on both sides. Now, one other reason that perhaps it might be good, coming to the digitization aspect, is if you are already making payments in a digital form, at least with the current infrastructure that we have and the way it's set up, the larger the amounts you pay, the smaller the cost, right? And so there is another unintended benefit on both sides, that if someone defers and then gets a lump sum, that rather than getting piecemeal payments, it's going to be cheaper for everyone. And it's just unfortunate that the smaller payments we make right now are going to be more expensive, usually for the end user, usually for the beneficiary. So cost is one thing to consider. Cost of the digital channel. The other thing to consider is, and when we talk about cost, is the fact that most digital payments today still get cashed out pretty much immediately. And so the biggest cost for most digital payment networks, and we're speaking mostly mobile money, is the cost of the agent and the agent network. You're going to pay someone to hold cash so that when someone comes to them to cash out, they can make that work. But if there are ways to keep it digital, and as the ecosystem grows and there are ways for someone to spend this cash digitally, then that cost will go down over time. Obviously, there's a cost to setting up the systems. There is training on both sides. One of the questions I have for Jason, if you could touch on the operational overhead for setting up something like this as a company. just like any other scheme, it's something that needs to be managed. And if we can think about the systems needed there, digital payments is easier, but if they have to get on board digital payments, it's going to be a bit of a training hurdle there.
I think I missed a little bit of the end of that question. So you're asking like, what are the sort of operational considerations for getting this going?
Yeah.
So
was it
actually
easy to do?
Go ahead.
Was it easy to do in the grand scheme of things as a company?
Yeah, this is a good point, right? So I think that people are often hesitant to change into doing new and different things. And so I think that the biggest barriers were more like some people in the management and kind of the more middle management of the firm thinking that this would be hard. Practically speaking, they have a person who designed and maintains their payroll software system, and we paid him something around $1,000 to make the changes, right? So you have to hire some of his time, and then there's a process of like feedback and testing that took some of our time as well. So it's not free to do. In the grand scheme of these things, it's pretty cheap. And I think that if you're actually economizing at all on costs, like if the firm is getting what they call the float, which is the interest on the money in between when it gets deferred and when it gets paid out, those benefits actually really quickly swamp the fixed costs of setting it up if people sign up for it, right? So I think a potential risk here is nobody really wants this thing. I would say that there were some people in the management at Lou Jerry who were firmly convinced that no one could possibly want this, because I think they're viewing it through the lens of being pretty financially well off. The banks treat them pretty well, and banks work just fine for them. They don't have the experience of being somebody who has a small amount of money in the bank, where it's a much worse experience, right? Because the fee structure is just totally proportional to how much money you have, just like any bank. So yeah, I think that there's some operational concerns there. There's this other operational concern that you raised having to do with mobile money agents and like liquidity or this cash holdings. That it's interesting. The original design of our study was going to have a parallel study arm where we did something like this, but through mobile money payments, or maybe just had mobile money based payments for the workers. And even at the small scale that we were aiming at, the logistics and the costs of having an agent network were just completely infeasible. And so we tried to do what you alluded to in terms of like create an ecosystem where everybody can do things digitally. But unless you have that ecosystem and it's a really strong one, then people are primarily just instantly cashing out. And that means that you have to have a person working essentially full-time cashing people out, and they have to like have a bunch of money on hand. So there's security issues, and there's a whole financial back end of this that like they have to maintain basically the liquidity to handle these cash outs.
Exactly.
And that is, I think, a big consideration with any kind of like pushing mobile money use of any kind. It's potentially a bigger consideration if you're creating bigger cash outs all at one time or something.
Right?
Yeah. If I could comment on keeping the cash digitally. So from my experience with in Give Directly, what we've found a number of times is people are so remote from the nearest agent. Like in DRC, we found places where it takes people an hour to get to the nearest agent. And so people are going to make that trip once and cash out immediately at once, because otherwise they're going to have to make multiple trips. There are costs of that trip as well. The other thing is that essentially all mobile money companies do not give interest, so the money just sits there. The ones that give interest have a very tiny interest, and so a lot of people prefer to take this money out and put it in village saving schemes where they'll make a little bit of interest. So I believe those are some of the things that contribute to people not leaving their money in the digital space.
Right.
Yes.
So an interesting potential way to think about the cash transfers then is Give Directly also does fairly large lump sums. And one thing I've suggested is, people may want it smoother. And this is an angle that Miriam and Lawson, Eric, and I have been pushing on with other Give Directly people, thinking about that. But also, if you're doing 2 big lump sums, but there's really high costs to getting the money out, then people may benefit quite a bit from having it just be one. And that doesn't even necessarily need to be a savings thing or even achieving a minimum scale of making a purchase or anything, but literally just the transportation and the time costs of spending, 2 hours round trip just to go, get your money from a guy, right? Or from a lady. Yeah.
Right, and if it's already digital, that might be another reason why you might want to defer, right? Because you want your payment to build up to the point that it makes sense for you to travel that hour to get the money out. Because if you are already being paid that way, and in fact, this might be a way to push to overcome some of the hurdles of digital payments. I think in places that programs have tried to do this and have found that some of the things we're talking about are limiting factors. I think that giving people the option in an easy way to decide when to cash out, to have the money build up to a certain point, could make it more attractive.
I also wonder whether these deferred payments or different kinds of payment timing might make it, and maybe this is what you mean, more feasible to build the key parts of the ecosystem, right? So when we were thinking about developing a mobile money ecosystem so that it could be feasible to pay people just through mobile money, we were essentially trying to create this entire network of everybody will take mobile money for everything. We will come in with some subsidies to pay them to compensate them for accepting it. And, trying to think, okay, but then there has to be somebody who these vendors who are selling things, how are they going to get their money, right? Or what are they going to do with it? But if you could just say, hey, look, there's one or two relatively big stores in town that will sell you key big assets and they'll just accept this. And they are part of some corporation or whatever, where they can they can handle that mobile money payment and actually have it be valuable to them instead of having to cash it out. Then maybe you start to solve that problem of there's a chicken and an egg, and where do we start? Right. Yeah. Nobody wants to be the first one who's stuck holding just these mobile money credits. Right. And it did seem like there was feasibility there because there were a couple of wealthier vendors who had a linkage between mobile money and their bank accounts and were using their bank accounts. And so they were avoiding some key fees and they were able to get the money straight into this other form. And then they could get money in cash if they needed ATM. They could also use their bank accounts to make other payments. And then that kind of would have closed the circuit. It's just we couldn't get quite enough momentum on there. But maybe if they also sell big things, then that helps with that piece. I have a question for Luke, actually for both Luke and Miriam. Are there places where you can think of where people are, I guess I'm thinking in sub-Saharan Africa, where people are transacting almost solely in mobile money, or is everywhere essentially fundamentally cash-based still that you can think of?
Miriam?
I can go. Yeah, I can go. So from my experience, no expert, of course, from my experience, what I've noticed is that people in places where the phone coverage is good, a lot of people tend to transact completely digitally. And this has really been affected by COVID. So when COVID came in, it's we all moved digital. So a lot of people now do all the transactions digitally. I mean, even in the markets now, you go to the regular markets and they're you just do a mobile money transfer. So it's happening more and more. If there's reliable cell phone connection, then people are going to do that, whether with a smartphone or with a regular non-smartphone, the USSD approach.
Right, and in cities for sure. I mean, if you're in Nairobi, pretty much you might not need cash. In fact, from your taxi driver to the coffee shop to every place you're in, you could just use mobile money. In fact, it's almost often preferred, even before COVID, Kampala to a lesser extent, certain cities where mobile money has reached its critical mass, and mainly where I think the mobile money providers have done this push around getting merchants to accept mobile money. We see that happening, and sometimes you hand over cash and people look at you crazy. What's that? You know. So I think it's certainly possible, but in 10 cities, in my view, more so than more remote parts of the country. I think perhaps because merchants haven't yet gotten that far out there with regard to digital payment acceptance.
Yeah, and just adding to that, what I have seen, in the Uganda, both rural and urban settings. So in the more urban settings, the telcos have given merchant numbers. We call it like Momo Pay, and so the cost to the customer is zero. In those cases, people have taken up using mobile money for all the transactions. But in more rural places, people haven't, the merchants do not have these merchant codes. And so the cost of using mobile money pay is really high for the user. And so people opt to go cash.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And it's also because the whole value chain needs to be digitized, right? The merchant who's accepting mobile money knows that he can buy goods digitally as well in the city. But if you're out there and he still has to turn around and pay cash, he needs to cash out that mobile money. And so the same thing happens. Now, in a lot of cases, a lot of merchants are also mobile money agents, some of the smaller ones, which helps, right? Because they need to have some float to pay out if someone's coming to do what's called cash in. And so by also using that for their grocery business, it helps even things out for them.
Right.
So there was a question in the chat about gender, and I wanted to kind of like bring it to this group. So have you found, or do you think you would find any differential impacts by gender? So on one hand, women might be less likely to have savings account, and this intervention could be a really promising way to offer them some method of savings. But on the other hand, if we're trying to implement this digitally, if there is some mobile access gap or other constraints in accessing mobile money, how can we kind of like reconcile those? How would we want to like address this and make sure that we're bringing in vulnerable populations and women into the fold?
So this is a good question. We certainly could look for variation in treatment effects by gender, and we may have done it for this main study. I just can't remember if there was any. Lhasa and I had a related earlier project that predominantly actually targeted women because the sort of fundamental work scheme that it was built around was for disadvantaged people, and women and widows in particular are considered disadvantaged. We didn't see any differences that were statistically significant in that subsample. Lhasa might remember whether we have. It's possible he even answered this in the chat already. I'm not sure. So yeah, I think he's remembering that we did not see any important differences, but the specter of like, people having less, financial access, or, if women are not, don't have access to mobile money or don't have phones, then if you're doing this through these digital and mobile payments, then that does create an angle for gender differences that didn't exist in our study. So in our study, they're all employees and there's no gender gap in access to being paid at, conditional being an employee.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Sorry, okay, right. So just interestingly, I read in a paper, I think it may have been the Blackman paper, the long-term effect of cash, not very sure though, where they sort of found that to a degree, it wasn't statistically significant. Men tended to spend their cash on larger assets, while women tended to spend on more recurrent household consumption. So it would be interesting to understand why the women did not choose the deferred payments, or if women would be less likely to choose deferred payments because the demand on their money is for more day-to-day expenditures. So that would be an interesting thing to find out, maybe qualitatively or something.
Right, that's really interesting, right? And I think that the context is going to affect how much that gap exists. I also, anytime I see, oh, there's like a basic gender difference, I wonder what percent of the people with these differences are actually in the same households with each other. So it could just be that there's this agreed household division where the man is earning money to make big purchases and the woman is earning money to make these small things, but like both sides of the household are actually getting like equal benefit from those purchases. And then there's other contexts where the money is very clearly going to something that only one person wants. And so that's just, there's a household dynamic there that you need to consider.
So we're out of time. I'm sure we could keep going on this conversation. So thank you so much for all of our panelists for joining us and all of our attendees for tuning in. I'm super grateful for the rich insights and discussion that we just had. So thanks everyone.
Great.
Thank you too.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody who came.
Bye everybody.
Thanks, Beth.